Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the My NHPCO Bereavement Professional Community Chat, Bereavement in the LGBTQ Community. And now I'd like to introduce the presenter for today, Reverend Dr. Don Stouder, volunteer manager and bereavement counselor at Reliance Hospice in Palm Desert, California, and the My NHPCO Bereavement Professional Steering Committee. Welcome everyone.
Well, hello and welcome from the Western time zone. It's morning here, so good morning. My name is Don Stouder, and as Don said, I'm the volunteer and bereavement manager here at Reliance Hospice in Palm Desert, which is a Palm Springs community. A little bit my background: I've been in healthcare for about 40 years. I started out as a paramedic, EMT paramedic in New Jersey, relocated to California. At one point or another, I decided I wanted to be a hospital chaplain, and I'm going to tell you about how that happened during this webinar. And I've been a trauma chaplain and a hospice chaplain ever since. So that's how I got here. I'd love it if you folks would tell us a little bit about how you got here in the chat section. Next slide, please. I want to begin by shilling a little bit for the My NHPCO page. It's at that link right there, mynhpco.org. And you can use your NHPCO email and password to get in there. It's a really interesting community of about 15 discipline-specific professional areas, and it's interdisciplinary focus. Next slide, please. There's some really useful parts of it. The professional communities chat, which a lot of us use all the time, discussion posts. Of course, these monthly chats are announced, and it's also an area to look at the recordings of ones you may have missed. There's lots of library entries and a blog. So it's a really, really helpful tool that we like to encourage everybody to use. Next slide, please. When it comes to our little bereavement professional community, if you have questions about membership in our little group, if you have topics you'd like to see us discuss, if you'd like to be a community committee member, feel free to reach out to one of us. And I especially want to emphasize the second one. If you have topics you'd like us to discuss, and or if you have topics that you'd like to present at one of these webinars, we would love to hear from you. So keep that in mind if you would. Next slide, please. I want to begin with a little land acknowledgement as a way of welcome to this part of the world that I'm in. I live in the Palm Springs area. And we have a really interesting dynamic here because a lot of us, even if we own our homes, are actually living on an Indian reservation, and we pay a land lease fee for the privilege of doing that. The city of Palm Springs, California, and its surrounding communities are all a part of the Coachella Valley, which stretches from the Banning Pass and the mountains of Big Bear to the north, all the way southeast some 75 miles to the Salton Sea and Imperial County, where most of your winter vegetables come from. It sits at the crossroads of two great southwestern deserts, the Mojave Desert and the Sonoran Desert. All of us here at Reliance Hospice acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, who are the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians, and we recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. With humility and gratitude, we pay respect to their elders past, present, and future. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the chat a little bit, and I again want to emphasize, make sure you have it set to everyone in that little click box so everyone can see what it is you're saying. Feel free to type your questions in there or even in the Q&A section. We obviously want you to share. We want your participation and input, and we'd love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already done that. Next slide, please. I want to also begin just by saying thank you to a couple of places that I shamelessly stole material from for this presentation today, including Bellacare Hospice, the NHPCO's LGBTQ resource guide. I'm going to talk more about that. The Desert AIDS Project of Palm Springs, my current employer, Reliance Hospice of Palm Desert, and two former employers that let me do a lot of work around this issue, Desert Regional Medical Center and the University of California, San Diego. Next slide, please. Our goal today is to deepen our empathy and sensitivity to the bereavement needs of the LGBTQ community. We want to understand how the AIDS pandemic informs contemporary grief responses. And we want to discover new ways of including the LGBTQ community in our grief and bereavement programming. Now, this third one is going to come more hopefully from some of you than all from me. I imagine there are lots of ideas and innovative programs out there, and we'd love to hear about those in our chat section as we go along. Next slide, please. So I want to ask you to take a deep breath, and I'm going to stop every once in a while through the presentation and repeat this request. And that's because we're going to talk about some difficult stuff. I'm going to touch on things and I'm going to press some buttons that might affect you personally, that might have touched you personally or touched someone you love personally. So I just want to remind you, take deep breaths, work on that self-care. I have a cup of coffee here ready if I need it. Hopefully you do too. And so let's go ahead and move forward. Next slide, please. In preparing for this workshop, a lot of people have said to me, well, what's different about grieving in the LGBTQ community? And it made me think a little bit, and certainly there are plenty of commonalities to grief. We all know that. And I think this quote from Vicki Harrison really sums that up well. Grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. And that's essentially true for everyone. But we also know that different cultures grieve differently, and different cultures bring different histories to how they grieve. And the LGBTQ community as a culture is really no different. Next slide, please. I just want to say something about myself. National Coming Out Day is coming up on October 11th. It's one of the reasons I chose October. I am in my early 60s, and I have been out as a gay man probably since I was 18 or 19. I'm also a long-term survivor of HIV. And so that's the history that I bring to my work and to this subject. But I also live in a very unique space. The greater Palm Springs area, they tell me now, has per capita probably the largest population, at least off season, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people of anywhere in the country, which I actually didn't know. So it's a unique market, if you will, to do hospice in. Next slide, please. I want to start with just a little bit of history. An awful lot of what we know to be the LGBTQ history is embedded in the 20th century. And an awful lot of that is not very positive. Early in the century, we, of course, had targeting by psychiatry and other medical professionals and random harassment and arrests. There was an uptick of people being willing to be more out about their sexuality in the 20s, and that was kind of tamped down as World War II came along. Lots, as I said, of targeting by psychiatry, whether that was human testing that was inappropriate, or simply families that could lock their loved ones away if they were caught doing some sort of a same-sex love act with another person. There was certainly plenty of religious oppression. As we enter the 50s, we get into the McCarthy area witch hunts. And then we start to see things change a little in the 60s, maybe late 50s, early 60s, this sort of awakening of gay liberation, the awakening of a lesbian feminism, of what we might later call queer culture. And the beginning of this era of gay pride starts to take shape. Next slide, please. And it's interesting to look at this in terms of generations, right? I'm going to quote Dr. Rosenfeld a couple times during this lecture, but as with all watersheds, these events' impacts were filtered through such characteristics as gender, ethnicity, class, and especially age at the time of the event. So people that she interviewed born before, say, 1930, their experience of all this was really formed in a new celebratory lesbian and gay culture that came out of things like the 1969 Stonewall uprisings and other events that really were significant event shaping in their experience of gay life. Next slide, please. As we moved kind of into the 60s and 70s, there were several figures that would come out of this gay pride movement. A really significant one of those was Harvey Milk. He was an activist in San Francisco who went on to be elected to the Board of Supervisors, the city Board of Supervisors. And then he and the mayor of San Francisco, Mayor Moscone, were shot to death on November 27, 1978. And this meant a lot of things to a lot of people, but I have the picture on the right there to show you, especially because what this became was a huge event of group grief, what I like to call it. On the right there's thousands of people that go back blocks and blocks and blocks, all carrying a candle, and they're marching from the Castro to City Hall on the night that Harvey and Mayor Moscone were murdered. And it was a quiet, sort of silent, somber march, but one of the very first really large ways that the gay and lesbian community showed how it is that they come together to share their grief with each other. And that's something that, as we'll see, would continue. Next slide, please. A few years later, in the early 80s, something else happened, what would turn into the second pandemic of my lifetime, the AIDS epidemic. Next slide, please. It would dramatically change how our community grieved together. It would dramatically change how folks who weren't a part of the LGBTQ community saw us. There would be positives that came out of this era. There would be horrible negatives that came out of this era. It's almost hard to wrap your brain around. Next slide, please. So a minute ago, I talked about those older gay people, but when HIV/AIDS emerged in the West, baby boomers born like 1946 to 1964 were aged 16 to 34. And for them, the high number of AIDS deaths at its peak kind of shaped their personal, social, psychological, and community lives during the epidemic, throughout their life course, and into later years. And that's something that I for sure see now, especially in older couples that we take care of here in our hospice. AIDS killed about 324,000 people in the USA between 1987 and 1998, when those death rates began to drop with the introduction of new medicines. Next slide, please. But here's the thing, a huge part of this cohort, gay male baby boomers, was lost. The epidemic hit male baby boomers much harder than it did older and younger men, causing high numbers of premature deaths, especially among those aged 25 to 44. In the USA by 1995, 1 gay man in 9 had been diagnosed with AIDS, 1 in 15 had died, and 10% of the 1.6 million men aged 25-44 who identified as gay had died. So it was a huge decimation of this cohort of baby boomer gay men. Next slide. The other thing that went on during all these years was, at least initially, an intense hostility from the government toward how this pandemic would be handled. And in the background of that, areas that had become gay and lesbian meccas were turning into ghost towns: San Francisco, New York, Chicago. But I talked about some of the good things that would come out of this time. It was also a time when this community and its supporters really learned how to take care of each other. And one of the most significant parts of that was how the lesbian community stepped up to find ways to take care of their gay brothers. In almost every city in America, you can find a a historic AIDS servicing community that was probably started by women. Next slide, please. Also, during this period of time when so much of this was so much in the public eye, the LGBT community also realized that people were warming up to their existence and their work in the community and their need for recognition and their own relationships and the way they form their families. And we realized that the more people saw this, the more people supported gay and lesbian folks just moving among them in the world. And so things like National Coming Out Day were made into big events because we figured out that the more people we could support in coming out, the more their families would accept them, the more their friends would accept them, the more the community would accept them. That turned out to be really wise and hugely successful. Next slide. The other thing, though, that continued to happen in our community were these events that brought people together in huge numbers to grieve together. And again, one of those events was the murder of Matthew Shepard on October 6, 1998. The fence that you see is the fence that Matthew was tied to and tortured and left for dead. He was tied to that like pictures you see of Jesus tied to the cross. And this, of course, coalesced community activism and community anger, but especially community grief. Next slide. The other thing that continued to happen, events that would cause the community to grieve, ones that go back in our history that would then echo all the way to our current time. You know, the Upstairs Lounge fire in New Orleans on June 24th, 1973. The outside doors to this long-standing, well-known gay and lesbian bar were locked from the outside, and then the building was set on fire. 32 dead and 15 injured. And then, of course, all of us, I think, can remember the Pulse nightclub shooting not very long ago in 2016. Someone walks into a club full of very young, very happy people, kills 49 and injures 52. And again, these events bring this community together in ways that they're forced to find to grieve. Next slide, please. And so what I think this leads to is what a lot of folks have come to call bereavement overload. And this sort of is the reason why I have discussed this history, because this plays a part when we take care of folks from this community today. Multiple ongoing individual and community losses that are coupled with complicating factors and may lead to this unending, sometimes, source of grief. Bereavement overload may involve disclosure of gender identity to unsupported family, friends, or social institutions, which can really complicate matters. And in my experience anyway, can lead to feelings of isolation. It can lead to guilt about good health and being alive. Am I allowed to be happy? Worry that they'll contract AIDS back in the day or now. Will we be injured if we go out to celebrate with our friends in a public place? Depression, possible suicidal ideation or attempts, difficulty coping. Sometimes people isolate, so their social support network may diminish. And of course, something that's been written about quite a bit in the LGBTQ community is turning to substances for self-medicating purposes. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of those moments where I've just thrown an awful lot of information at you, and some of it's scary and some of it might touch on personal things. So take a deep breath. And I also want to invite my colleagues on the steering committee to comment if you'd like at this point. And I'd also invite folks to insert questions or comments up to this point in the chat section or the Q&A section. Allie, is there any questions coming up that I should look at?
There aren't any questions. We just had a comment from Christopher, kind of echoing what you're talking about. and being underprepared for the coming wave of boomers and Gen X LGBT identifying folks who are facing end of life. And so I think all of us are excited to continue this conversation and increase our skill set. And I appreciate your vulnerability today and, just giving us such wise counsel from a really unique perspective.
Well, certainly Christopher's right. And here in communities like ours in California, and I'm sure in large cities, et cetera, we're certainly already seeing that boomer population age into needing hospice care. And I could tell some stories about that, uniquely, even in a place like Palm Springs, where we have such a large population. That doesn't mean that everybody who works in hospice is necessarily prepared to work with that community. And so, we see weird little conflicts that maybe show themselves as a family member calls into the hospice office and says, you know what, I would really like it if you'd only send a male or if you'd only send a female, because those are the folks that they can relate to. Or maybe we'll get weird complaints about, I don't really feel like my caregiver is listening to me or understanding me. And those, what we think are simple issues, sometimes just come right down to maybe a lack of cultural awareness around the community we're dealing with. And that's true not just for the LGBTQ community, but for any community that's different from the one you are a member of. Next slide, please. I should say that the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. And God knows we need to say this about every minority culture when we talk about what people believe and what they don't believe. So some things that I'm going to say I may feel more strongly about than say other people of my generation or different generations. Nobody in the culture is in any culture is a monolith. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. I'm just, I'm sorry, just traveled over the comments. And Barbara writes, however, lesbians, while some were engaged in caregiving, did not have the same level of trauma as the men's community. So generally speaking, do not assume that what is true for gay men is true for lesbians. Absolutely true. And it ties right into what I just said. Next slide, please. So perhaps grieving in the LGBTQ community is different in some ways. The person who wrote this article, Sue Rakowski, says, grieving the loss of a loved one is horrific enough, but it is even harder when you're a member of the LGBTQ community. I know. I've felt this disenfranchised grief. Gay grief is marginalized. Many of us, depending on where we live and what kind of network we have, are excluded from experiencing society's mourning process. Next slide, please. Certainly more and more we're seeing some good research being done around this issue. This particular article, which you can find if you do a Google search, is a good summary, a systematic review of some of the research that's been done out there, but most of it with couples and the loss of a significant partner, both men and women. And there's some real common themes, I think, that come out of this research as we look at it. Next slide, please. Probably the biggest thing is the notion of disenfranchised grief. Grief that occurs when someone experiences a loss that's not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. The relationship may be viewed as unimportant, replaceable, or stigmatized. It might be ignored or rejected altogether. And as a result, the bereaved are not given full permission to grieve their loss. An interesting example of this is perhaps a part of the country where it's not so safe to be, quote unquote, out of the closet. And your spouse dies, but you're unable to take time off from work because you can't tell your employers why you want that time off. You've kept that part of your life a secret, perhaps from your employer, perhaps from friends. That was a more common happening, more common example in days gone by than it is now, but we certainly still hear stories about this notion of disenfranchised grief that are common in marginalized communities. Next slide, please. Of course, the exclusion of chosen families is a notion that I've worked with personally. I'm sure a lot of you have. Members of the LGBTQ community are more likely to be estranged from their relatives and instead rely on a close network of friends. And we often call that a chosen family. But families of origin, our families of origin, may not accept this friendship network and exclude them from funeral planning or memorializing. A couple examples of this, one from days gone by and one more contemporary. In my early days of working with folks with AIDS as a volunteer chaplain at the time, it was common for me to be called to the hospital because a young man was dying from AIDS and his boyfriend was with him, but then in fly mom and dad from some other part of the country. Mom and dad immediately exclude his significant other from the room, won't let him visit, won't let him be there for the end of his lover's life, won't let him participate in the memorial service. They just simply excluded entire communities because they could. The law allowed them to do this. A more contemporary example is two women that were clients of mine. One died of cancer, and everybody got along well. The family, the woman who died had children from a previous marriage. Everybody got along well. But when she died, those children from the previous marriage immediately excluded her wife. And since they weren't legally married, they'd never really thought that they needed to, even though they were together for something like 45 years, that family excluded that longtime partner from everything from funerals to being able to be with her at the end of their life. So this exclusion of chosen families is a real issue, and it still happens around the country. Next slide, please. Another thing that tends to happen that can be incredibly emotionally distressing for trans people is this idea of misgendering. For trans people, there's a number of barriers to acquiring legal documentation that reflects their gender identity. And in death, this can lead to healthcare workers or funeral practitioners misgendering, or also what we call dead naming them, which means calling them by a name they used before they transitioned. And for friends and family, especially at this really vulnerable time, this can really be horrifically distressing. Next slide, please. So a couple other examples of issues that come up. Older individuals have relationships that are as long-term as many marriages. I just had some clients who've been together for 55 years, yet the significance of those relationships are often minimized by the larger culture. Even for those who knew the couple, the loss might not be recognized at the same level, right? They think of my husband differently because we're a same-sex couple. Some people will call him my friend, even to this day. Some people will call him my roommate instead of my husband. And that attitude, of course, can increase vulnerability and mourning, and can sometimes develop into issues like anxiety and depression. There's a difference between tolerance and respect, so it might be difficult to access positive, consistent supports in different parts of the country. In some places, assisted living and retirement communities don't accept LGBT couples. And even if they do, those couples can face prejudice from staff or other residents that can lead to inadequate care. Next slide. Here's another interesting issue. One partner may have been more open about their sexual orientation than the other, and it can lead to conflict for the surviving partner about how to refer to their deceased loved one and how much to reveal to friends and family. LGBT survivors may not feel comfortable joining overwhelmingly heterosexual support groups, which contributes to their vulnerability at an already very vulnerable time. And this one is a biggie around the country. Even still, documentation, even for legally married gay couples, needs to be carried because it's almost always going to be asked for. Heterosexual couples who enter a hospital and one says, I'm the husband or I'm the wife, typically aren't asked to prove that. Even still today, in almost every circumstance, gay and lesbian couples are asked to prove that. Even in things like calling a funeral home to have the deceased moved from a hospital bed. Next slide, please. So often state laws contribute to lack of rights and access to resources such as inheritance, adoption, equal and fair housing practice, fair hiring, and workplace conditions. And as I said earlier, some folks in the LGBT community might fear the risk of losing employment if openly mourning their gay partner. A lot of people think there are protections in place for being fired just because you're gay or lesbian or bi or trans. In many states, no such protections exist. And it's important that folks know that. And of course, when seeking comfort during a time of grief and loss, these couples with strong religious faith often experience judgment rather than support when they try to go back to their churches or synagogues of origin. Next slide, please. A couple other common issues I want to touch on. Anticipating discrimination, right? If I feel like I'm going to be discriminated against in a healthcare setting, it increases anxiety. Complexities of religion, we talked a little bit about. People making assumptions about identity and family structure, which might not be accurate. A wide variety of support networks, some that look like chosen families, some may be completely different. I know one person who their Dungeons and Dragons gaming group is their family. They're all a group of gay and lesbian and trans folks, and they're each other's family. And that's what we mean when we talk about different kinds of family structure. Unsupported grief and bereavement we've talked about, and evidence shows that LGBT people are more likely to receive palliative care support late in the trajectory of an illness or not receive it at all. And so that means there's an additional burden on caregivers who might not benefit from all these resources that we all know palliative care and hospice can bring to the table. Next slide. Another one of those moments for me to have a sip of my coffee and you to take a breath, ask some questions, and contribute to the conversation.
Thanks, Don. We've had some great comments come in the chat. Tracy commented about the statement that you made, tolerance versus respect, loving that phrase, and that it's a huge issue in the quote unquote Bible Belt. And maybe this resonated with me as well, being here in Nashville, Tennessee, but such an important thing for us to recognize and remember and keep at the tip of our tongue, this idea that respect goes far deeper than just tolerance. Callie's comment is talking about challenges to a surviving partner when the relationship was not public and that those around them aren't understanding the depth of that relationship and therefore the depth of their pain and grief. And then Craig shared when he was a case manager with a person with HIV/AIDS, it seemed that more men were more afraid to tell their families that they were gay than to tell them that they had HIV. That's really interesting. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more, maybe in the experience of those that you've supported or in your own.
Yeah, I mean, that is, it's absolutely true. And I mean, imagine that for a second, right? Just hold that in your imagination. The idea that a person would be more afraid to tell their family that they were gay than they had a potentially life-ending illness, that the notion that being gay would bring more shame on a family than a pretty stigmatized disease, if we're being honest, right? So, I mean, what a hard thing to wrap your brain around. That wasn't my personal experience. I had a pretty supportive family, pretty supportive friends, and my experience of coming out and telling my family that I had HIV was certainly frightening for them because it was a frightening time. We didn't know how it was going to turn out back then. I didn't know if I'd, be around long enough to give this webinar today. But it wasn't my experience that it was harder to tell them I was gay, but I certainly know plenty of people who that was their experience. Anybody on the panel want to speak to that? Okay, Allie, I see
This
you.
is Karen, and I will speak to that.
Go ahead.
That was such a wonderful comment, and thank you for that perspective, Dr. Don. I started in hospice care it's been several decades, we'll just put it that way. But when I came into hospice, definitely the serving in the area and the community that I serve, many of my patients were AIDS patients, many of them. And that was, an interest. That was, now that you bring that up, that is really an interesting concept that I really did see that. I can particularly remember being in a patient's room where, the family was there and they supported him and they knew what illness he had, but the struggle and the conversation was, how did he acquire it? And he definitely did not want to share at all about anything else besides the illness. And it was a struggle. So having said that, I did see that often, where people were very open to share that they had AIDS, but were really hesitant to share with the family that they were gay. So that's interesting. And thank you for sharing that. And I think that's why it was so important for us to come in as the hospice care providers and be able to support that patient, where that patient didn't have to feel necessarily disenfranchised with us, because we could talk openly and support them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Karen. And I also want to share something popped up in the question and answer box, a little relative to our conversation a few minutes ago, but I really want to share it. Christopher, one thing I'm seeing is post-marriage equality fractalization of the community, with more mainstreaming and fewer non-social media gathering places, aka bars versus Grindr, which has reduced the number of younger members of the community not mixing with older gays. Historically, there would have been supports with more mixing. That, with estrangement, has left more older LGBT people here in Fort Lauderdale without protective friends, POAs, proxies, and more vulnerable to both corporate and individual bad actors. That's a really, really good observation. I have seen less of that in my community. And I spent most of the rest of my career in San Diego, where I really felt like generations mixed well and continue to. There was mentoring. It just seemed like a very healthy back and forth relationship. But I'm sure what you're describing, Christopher, exists. Next slide, please. This is a really great comment from Rabbi Lippman of VITAS. It's important for us as healthcare workers to affirm LGBTQ people, acknowledge their right to healthcare and hospice access, and treat them with human respect and dignity. That's kind of the bottom line, isn't it? There's another quote by someone who was the CEO of Bellacare Hospice, Dr. Jim Collins. And I really like this quote too. Death, dying, and post-death events will be experienced in a variety of ways based upon many social, psychological, and physical factors, including gender identity. As healthcare professionals, we should be true to our ethical standards of care and never discriminate based on any personal or social identifier. We should always be guided by our ethical principles of autonomy, beneficence, the common good, confidentiality, justice, non-malfeasance, stewardship, and truth-telling, just to name a few. A person, either heterosexual or LGBTQ, will die only once. We need to get it right every time. I think that's one of the most powerful quotes that I've read on the issue. I was really glad to find it. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what does inclusive bereavement care maybe look like. And the ideas that I have here on a couple of slides are random. They're not in any particular order. All of them could probably be presentations on their own, but I'll go through them and of course ask your questions and make your comments in the chat section. So first of all, knowing when and where to refer. I know a lot of you have already said it in the comments. I know some of you are thinking it. We touched on it earlier. It is not at all unusual for members of the LGBTQ community to feel uncomfortable in a mixed grief group, and they often won't come to one. So having some referrals up your sleeve, if those things are available in your community, can be really, really helpful. If there isn't one in your community, maybe it's time for you to think about putting one together. And that involves you reaching out to the LGBTQ community if you're not already a part of it. Finding allies that you can work together with to develop groups unique to this community. I'm lucky. Here in the Palm Springs area, I probably have 3 different well-organized groups that I can refer people to. I can, when I have more than 2 or 3 LGBTQ couples in hospice at one time, we sort of put together a group for those people when we need to. I have resources, but I understand that a lot of communities may not. And so you might have to reach out to know where to refer folks to. If you can't make a grief group happen, maybe you can find counselors, for example, who have experience and are members of the LGBTQ community to be able to refer to those people. Number 2, recognizing the many definitions of family. We have talked about that, as well as number 3, these different levels of openness. And it's just really important to listen. And when someone tells you what their family looks like, acknowledge it and respect it. And that's as important as number 4, treating couples like couples. A couple of studies talk about how lack of relationship validation causes extreme discomfort and anxiety and pain among LGBTQ couples at the end of life. They're not acknowledged as a couple. So acknowledge them and treat them that way. Number 5, be delicate with spiritual issues. When you're talking about the LGBTQ community, you're talking about a group of people who've been directly targeted by religious organizations for generation after generation after generation. And I say that as an ordained minister. It's important to suss out if they want spiritual support, if so, what kind. And again, back to knowing when and where to refer. Know some resources you might have in your community, supportive churches, supportive clergy. Number 6, if you can't be genuinely present, then withdraw. I'm not going to judge you if you have issues with folks who are gay or lesbian or bi or trans, but if you have difficulty working with those people, you owe it to us to back off and ask someone who's a little more comfortable with our community to step in. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I also think it's a historical precedent in healthcare. If we're uncomfortable with a case, if we're uncomfortable doing something ethically, we owe it to ourselves and to our patients to step back and ask someone else to step in. I want to give you permission to do that. I also want to ask you to watch out for heteronormative assumptions. Don't assume that because your family is one way, this gay and lesbian family you're dealing with might be that way as well. Number 8, watch out for isolation. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's especially true. I'm seeing more of it in older gay and lesbian couples. When one passes away, the partner, husband or wife that's left has a tendency to isolate. Watch out for that as a grief counselor. Next slide, please. Remember how young some of us were. All of us in my age group and older started seeing horrific things when we were pretty young. Keep in mind that we might have some baggage. Keep in mind that that baggage might affect how we act, maybe even how we treat you. Throw a little grace our way if we're inappropriate. And that also leads to number 2, gently probe about survivor guilt, because there's plenty of that in our community. Why didn't AIDS kill me? Why didn't the shooter at the Pulse nightclub kill me? There's a lot of survivor guilt in our community. And I think it may drive a grief and bereavement to some degree, and it's worth addressing in that setting. Number 3, respect a spectrum of confidentialities. We've talked about some of them, but you may encounter, say, a new admit who does not want certain family members given information, but will allow certain non-family members to get information. We call that our confidential information form here at Reliance. I don't know what you call it, but it's being aware that they may not have a normal continuum of, or at least what's normal to you, of who they want information given to. Similarly to 1 and 2 is 4, be prepared for anger. There's a joke that I like to tell that through my entire professional life, almost as a chaplain, all of us every year have to get an annual evaluation, and they check off all these boxes and et cetera. You've all given them, you've all been the recipient of them. And my joke is that all my evaluations, all these years, all say, we love Don, we love Don, we love Don, we love Don, except he's got this little angry edge. And the truth is, yes, I have had an angry edge. I came out of a time where you could almost not feel anything else but anger. I've been lucky that I've had the resources and the friends and family and the therapy to work through things like that, but be prepared for it when you're dealing with members of this community. But at the same time, I want to encourage you or rather encourage our tendency to rebuild, reconcile, and re-engage, because that's one thing that our community does awfully well. And we've seen that in these great highs of victory and in these lows of sadness. One thing about the LGBTQ community that has just always been true, it's true of lots of other marginalized groups too, is our ability to celebrate, our ability to rebuild and reconcile and re-engage, and finally be open to discovery. You're going to learn new things if these are communities you've never worked with before. Own that, say thank you for it, ask to be a part of it. Next slide. NHPCO put out a resource a couple of years ago that I want to recommend to you. I think it's only free if you're a member of NHPCO, but in any event, you can find it here, nhpco.org/diversity. Our LGBTQ resource guide is helpful, I think, in bereavement settings, but it's probably more helpful in learning how to reach out to LGBTQ community. Next slide, please. One thing that I want to mention when I talk about how we have the ability to mourn and celebrate almost in the same breath is this sentence, which is the last line of the Supreme Court ruling written by Justice Anthony Kennedy that legalized same-sex marriage throughout the United States. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. Those words still sometimes bring tears to my eyes in the notion that much recognition could happen in my lifetime. And while it's true that people are trying to chip away at that, and while it's true that reality may bring anxiety to the folks that you're trying to help move through their grief and bereavement, it's still an enormous victory, and one that we continue to celebrate to this day. Next slide, please. So let's take a few minutes for questions, and then I have just one more thing to end on, but questions, comments, a lot of things have gone by my chat window that I haven't been able to catch, so I'll leave that to Allie and others.
Yeah, Don, we might need to backtrack a couple of slides. And we did receive a question about number 6 on your first slide in supporting LGBTQ folks. One more, I think.
Number 6, if you can't be genuinely present, withdraw.
Yes, and so I think the statement was just, does this allow people in healthcare to, continue on with some homophobia in a field that should be accepting of all people? And so I think her point was, we don't allow racism. And so, would this be a situation where it's kind of an easy out, I'm gathering, is kind of her concern in thinking about withdrawing?
And I totally hear that from whoever made the comment. And in fact, I would expect that. I'm just going to be real for a second and say that I'm a pragmatic guy. And in the moment when somebody needs help, I don't care what you think. I want them to have their help. I'm not in a mood to debate you about whether or not you should get your homophobia looked at or dealt with. I want to help that person who needs help. So that's where my pragmatism comes from. Of course, I agree with her. I agree with her statement. We don't allow racism. We don't allow any of these things at the bedside. Why should we allow this? And I'm not advocating to allow it. I'm advocating for, if you're that person, let somebody else step in, because I'm more worried about the guy in the bed or the woman in the bed.
Mhm. Great, great. Thank you for that clarification. And it's a situation where you can definitely see both sides, but what I think wins out is getting them the care and appropriate level of acceptance that they need in that moment. So we had another great comment come in from Amanda asking if you've had the opportunity to work with any LGBT veteran couples, realizing that we have a lot of resources for supporting vets around end of life, but little is grief related, kind of intertwining those two.
So the answer is yes. I haven't had even one that I can think of couple where they were both in the military, but I've had many, many, many where one was. And maybe it's because we're in California, but there's, especially from the VA out here, there's really no hesitation to provide the same level of respect and dignity that we are doing our best to give all vets to gay and lesbian vets. I haven't really seen any difference. Certainly, as a hospice, we're not treating them any differently, but just things like helping people get into a national cemetery or sending out an honor guard to a funeral or whatever it happens to be. We're not seeing any issues with that here in California, but I don't want to discount that that might be an issue elsewhere.
Great, thank you. I'm just scrolling through the chat here. Pamela mentioned the VA is offering a training on supporting the LGBTQ community tomorrow afternoon. How timely. Thank you, Pamela.
Any other comments or questions? Anybody on the panel want to comment before I take us to a close?
Don, since we do have a couple of minutes, I wanted to ask if you've had any experience with regard to working with minors who might be on hospice service or receiving bereavement support, and just the delicacy and challenge that it takes when maybe they're not out to their families and a guardian might be presenting them for treatment, but they might prefer a different name or use different pronouns in the clinical setting. I'm wondering if you've encountered any of that complexity and can speak to any tips to guide us through that.
I've spent very little of my career, except when I was doing trauma in pediatric settings, and that's still true today. And we don't do pediatric hospice where I am at now. That said, I'm a parent to a gay man and a grandparent to a trans young lady. And I think, again, I'm going to speak for being in California, because to a degree, we're a little bit spoiled out here. I'm in Southern California, where acceptance is a pretty high level. And I don't see or hear those issues happening here. But to address directly some of the comments that you made, I think the best we can do is take the lead from the patient in front of us. So if the patient in front of us is a minor who wants to be called certain things, we should honor that. If they want to not have us tell their parents certain things, now we have to probably have conversations with our peers. And we probably need to talk about what is ethical and what isn't, and what is legal and what isn't. And of course, that varies state to state. In a place like California, that minor would have a lot of latitude, especially over the age of 14, to control what information we give to their parents. And of course, the situational part of it has a part to play too. But that's really the most I can speak to that, just because of a sheer lack of experience with the population.
No, I think that you make a really great point to keep in mind the person that's in front of you and let their needs guide those conversations as they come up. There was another question just placed into the chat and that mentions what a surprise it is that in a metropolitan area like theirs, they found very limited grief support groups for the LGBT community, and that they're considering starting one. So any recommendations for resources on groups specifically?
if you are in a fairly large metropolitan area, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a gay and lesbian trans center somewhere in that community. If there isn't one close to you, there almost certainly is one in the next closest large city. I would reach out to that center. I guarantee you they've probably tried to start bereavement groups before and may or may not have been successful. I guarantee you they probably have resources you can use to do that. And maybe you can use that as an opportunity to partner. But I'd absolutely reach out to a local or the closest gay and lesbian center to you. And it'd be hard for me to imagine a place in the country where there wasn't one within the community or fairly close by. Somebody else just posted another really good resource, LGBTQ Health Equity Center of Excellence, and I'd recommend that too. So I'm going to ask to go to the next slide. And I want to first of all thank everybody for joining us today. Around 100 of you took the time out of your day to talk about this subject, and I think it's really, really important. So I want to say thank you to you. I want to say thank you to NHPCO for letting us do this. I want to say thank you to the other members of the Bereavement Steering Committee who have helped today. And I want to end by showing you this picture of the Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt. The quilt was probably one of our country's historical, most grandest ways that a culture memorialized their dead. And I wanted to show you this quilt because at the bottom is a pink one, and that one was made for my oldest brother, Robert, who died of AIDS in 1993. I want to dedicate today's presentation to him, and I want to once again thank all of you for being here today. Go in peace.
Thank you very much, Don. And that concludes today's chat. And thank you very much again, Don, and the BP Steering Committee and all y'all for attending. Now, as a friendly reminder, today's chat recording will be made available in the MyNHPCO Bereavement Professional Community Library in a few days alongside the slides, which I'll post again. Please join us next month for our next chat on November 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, I'm going to post a link to the MyNHPCO Bereavement Professional Community in mynhpco.org. And there you can continue the conversation. And also, if you're interested in joining the MyNHPCO Bereavement Professional Community Steering Committee, you can click on the green Learn More button at the top of the screen to learn about applying for steering committee service. And then lastly, when we close out this Zoom chat, please be sure to follow the link to take the post-chat survey that'll pop up on your screen. Your suggestions help us plan for future community chats. Again, thank you very much, Don, for sharing, and everyone else for attending today. And please have a great day and take care of yourselves. Thank you.